recording. Yeah, thank you. We're kind of like mid-conversation already while we have a few more people arriving, so we'll, oh, good, you got it. We tried to get, I looked for the interview online, Carol, and I couldn't find it. So thank you for sharing that. Anyway, welcome everybody. Delighted to have folks back for this or joining us if this is your first time with us. Before we dive into kind of further conversation about the novel, I wanted to share the interview that Carol Stern just placed in the chat that's in Moment Magazine. It's a very short interview. And there's a bunch more. If people want, I could, for the next time, put together some links and you could go follow some things and see what's out there. And then Luther, you sent me a link to a project that's it's not directly related, but an interesting, different take on this. And I thought maybe you could talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it occurred to me when I saw a review of it. And full disclosure, this is a book of poetry, and it's written by a friend of mine, which otherwise I might never have seen it. It is the protagonist. It is really it's a novel in verse. The protagonist, Spess, is a cell phone. It's an iPhone. And over the course of her work, Sarah's work, the iPhone develops sentience and self-awareness. And so it touches on some of the issues that Piercy's book touches on. And what I'll do is I'll put some links in the chat if you all are interested.
Sure.
You can follow those. There's a link to a review. There's a link to Sarah reading in Tacoma Park from the book, and a link to the book itself. So you may want to just copy them out. You don't want to listen to Sarah reading from her book while Sherry is presenting on Marge Piercy's book. That's weird, but I'll put all of those in the chat.
Yeah, Anita, I was thinking of her as well. I don't know if you all saw that film from, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, maybe a little longer, about the relationship that somebody forms with the Siri-like figure in that you can talk to in the phone. I think there's a number of texts that are out there that talk about various forms of technology becoming not just sentient, but independent, and the kinds of relationships that human beings then form with them. The starting place for much of that is actually Isaac Asimov's I, Robot, that kind of thinks about the development of robots and how they change over time and the relationships that we have with them, some of the rules about how they are allowed to function. I don't remember the exact rules, but Asimov actually developed some rules for robot behavior, including things like robots can't harm humans. That really comes out of lots of writers trying to imagine some of the conditions that we have now. The kinds of things that are developing with artificial intelligence, the kinds of things that are developing with robotics. We know, for example, that there's robotics work going on about providing companions for elderly people who are living on their own, who provide companionship, but also some of the kinds of support and services that a support animal or a human aid might provide. So we've moved a long way in that direction. We're going to talk a little bit later tonight a bit more about technology and the problems that technology can cause in the world and some of the questions that it raises. I want to start tonight with a little bit of, kind of as we did last time, thinking about how a novel works, and then ask you to chime in on some of this and we'll go from there. So we started last time with the idea that novels create worlds. Part of what a novelist has to do is imagine the world in which their story takes place. It might be a very realistic world. It might be a very imaginary world. And they have to create that world in a way that we will believe it. Even if we look at it and think that everything in that world is impossible, we still have to believe in it. Same thing with the characters. They create characters and then show us how those characters act and interact and think and feel, and all of that helps to make those characters realistic to us. But the other thing that a novelist has to do is cause trouble. What lies at the heart of any narrative, really, and especially at a novel, is problems, difficulties, trouble. And that trouble can come from the characters' interactions with their world. It can come from their interactions with other characters. It can even come from their tensions within themselves. And it's those troubles that drive the narrative. You've probably heard the idea that any work of fiction will have a kind of beginning and then an arc where there is a peak of conflict and then a resolution. That sounds very simple, but as a novel like this reminds us, that path is rarely simple. But nonetheless, we need to pay attention to what the troubles are. And we need to think about the fact that some of the troubles are very large and some of them are smaller, more internal. So some of them drive the whole narrative, and some of them help us to understand characters. So I want to ask, as we get started tonight, for you to put in the chat some of the trouble that you see in this novel. What are the conflicts? What are the difficulties that that either drive the plot as a whole or that help us to understand the characters? I'm going to give you a minute to do that, and I'm going to go turn off the fan that is on behind me in my room because I want to make sure you can hear me well. So you guys populate the chat, and we'll be right back. So we have a great list building. Let me start by asking this. As you look at the things that people have put in the chat, can you give me an example of a piece of trouble that serves primarily to help us understand a character? And I'm going to remind you again, as we did last time, please use under reactions, use the raise hand tool, and that way we can call on people in order. What kinds of trouble happens that really helps us understand these characters? Ralph.
Well, I guess you have Yod in his search for, what is humanity? What's sentience?
Yeah, which helps to develop him as a character.
Yeah,
right?
and how he's programmed, what went into him.
Absolutely. Also probably helps us understand the characters surrounding him, right? That central question about Yud's character and Yud's humanity provides opportunities for Piercy to tell us a little bit more about Malka, to tell us a little bit more about Avram, to take us further inside of Shira's character. It's also one of the plot driving tensions in this. So we'll cycle back to it before we're done tonight. But I think it's important to think about how that central point of problem drives both character and plot. Elise?
Yeah, thanks. This is kind of related to what you're saying. I was thinking Shira's being drawn to Yad is sort of a reflection of how wounded she is, by not having connected with her mother, and her relationship with Gadi being ended so dramatically, that she has this sort of need, and almost like an artificial man who's almost too perfect is what draws her in.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation. And, in talking about that, Elise, you've talked about several of the points of trouble that come up in Shira's life. Going back to her relationship with Gadi is probably the earliest one that we hear about, because we hear about them as teenagers. There's some tension in her relationship with Malka, only really about the kind of grandmother-granddaughter thing and what happened to her mother. Her marriage to Josh, her loss of her son. A bunch of people noted, Shira's search for her child and her desire to reclaim her child, which is another one of those things that's both a plot element and a character element. But all of these things that point to the idea that Shira is herself a character with some wounds. It's a wonderful way to put it. And that her struggles in life play out in all of these different kinds of relationships and in the central tensions of the novel. So in her relationship with Yud, in her relationship with YS, there's a wonderful, terrible observation that comes up at some point where, as she begins to get access to her own files from YS, they go and they have this meeting and they come back with the files after they've done this kind of foray into the net. And she comes to realize that she's been treated in the ways she has, not because she wasn't a good scientist, not because she wasn't good at her job, but because they had other things they wanted. And that's a really key shift for her in not quite healing her wounds, but in helping her think more about that. And then, of course, her relationship with Yod that proves healing and yet also still problematic. And I want to come back to that as well before we're done. So Joan or Bob, I don't know which of you. I see a hand up and it's Joan's name.
It was me.
Okay.
I just wondered if it was a coincidence or if the name of the corporation, which was Y/-S, that there was a Japanese and a German name. And I wonder if that was reflecting on the Axis powers in World War II, or whether that was just a sheer coincidence.
That's a great question. I don't know if she was going back to that, or if she was rather trying to show us in naming that something about how globalization is working in this period, and the power of the global corporations, and the ways that they created unexpected alliances. She makes an offhand reference somewhere along the line to another corporation that is Ford Aramco, which I thought was interesting, linking an oil company with a car company. So I think she's doing some things to try to help us see the geopolitical tensions, some of which are part of the background of the world that she's created, and some of which clearly drive the plot.
And that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah. Interesting just to think about all of those different kinds of things, and how all of these, there's lots of interpersonal and internal points of tension and trouble that people run into. Certainly Shira's relationship or non-relationship with her mother, and her desire for that relationship, and the fact that it can't be fulfilled, that is part of that wounding. So a lot of that is about developing Shira. We get a lot of things that help to develop Yod as a character, which in turn, so setting aside the whole question of humanity and the whole question of technology, which we're going to get to very shortly. But just the idea that he has a personality, that he has a psyche, and that is in some ways shaped by things that are not unlike some of Shira's concerns. Ideas about parent-child relationships, Yud's relationship with Avram, and, Yud, who admits at some point that he calls Avram father in the hope that Avram will see him not only as a full human being, but feel a kind of parental care for him. Yud's sense of being out of place, of trying to make sense of the world, that is not that different from Shira's trying to make sense of what's going on with YS and how to get her child back. So I think there's a number of ways in which those things echo each other. And I think it's helpful just to be conscious of all of that. People also talked in the chat, we have this long list of points of trouble, and all of the environmental things, both social environment and physical environment. And I want to dig in a little bit to both of those things. So it seems to me that mere survival is one of the points of trouble in this novel, and all of the ways that the state of the natural environment creates trouble. Some of this is so obvious, I hate to ask, but I'd love to get people to just observe for a minute some of the ways in which the state of the physical environment is making life difficult for people in this novel. That was not a hard question, folks. Malka, I see your hand up down in the square,
Okay,
so go ahead,
one
and then we'll
way
go
is-
to Annie and Elena.
Oh, one way is that they have to go outside, they have to have a complete cover from the elements.
Right. So just stepping outside is dangerous. And if you have a cover, that's great. If you don't, you have to figure out other ways of dealing with it. Annie.
I was about to say something similar, which is just, sorry, I've just had oral surgery, so my mouth doesn't work right. But the sheer difficulty of living in the world, if you're not in a protected place, and the way that the haves in some way are in the protected places, and the people in the glop, or they mentioned the barrio or the other outside places, are the lower levels of society. And everybody that we deal with in this book is pretty privileged. And one of the ways you can tell that is that they live in a protected place.
Yeah. And I love that tie of the environmental problems to issues of social class and issues of privilege, and that is also tied to where you fit in. So part of that is about intellectual ability and connections and that kind of thing. But part of it is also about understanding the power structures and the economic structures of the world that Piercy has imagined. And there's a sense both of privilege that characters have. They are conscious of their privileges in some ways. And yet that is also something that they're hanging on to fairly desperately, really trying to make sure that they don't lose, because class has become a life or death thing in this world. And that therefore makes it that much more dramatic. Elena.
I mean, I think something that gets repeated throughout is the difficulty of humanity subsisting at all because of the fertility problems that are described as being, throughout, which is also sort of interesting, because to the extent that the larger picture is that the earth has been destroyed by humanity, the notion that people would be simultaneously desperately trying to hang on and produce another generation is sort of, it's an interesting dichotomy or something.
Yeah, it is. It's this will seem like a a huge detour, but I'll just throw this in because I've been thinking a lot about this in the last couple of weeks, because there was a news story recently about China's population crisis, because people are not having enough babies, and yet also thinking about how all of that population contributes to the environmental issues. And we have this paradox that we need more people, and yet we know that more people contributes to the challenges of the environment. And in some ways we see some of that in this novel. But then we also see, in part because our connection to people having children is Shira, who, as we're told in the section of the novel that we looked at for today, was seen by other people in YS as sort of old-fashioned and archaic and weird, because she wanted to have a child in the quote in what we would call the normal way, that was considered just very strange, and that she has this incredibly powerful sense of connection to her child, which we don't see that much with other characters in this. So I think we get some sense of that kind of paradox of all of this, that she in particular wants her child. And it also a bit of an irony with that she so wants her child, and her mother did not. Her mother, there were other things her mother was doing that mattered more to her. And so we get these different versions of what motherhood might mean in women's lives. It's a good reminder that Piercy is identified primarily as a feminist writer. And part of what she's doing is showing us the range of possibilities for women's lives. Annie, you're muted.
I wondered if that had something to do with the fact that she was ahead of her time, or her mother was ahead of her time in not raising her. And so she felt a stronger desire to be a mother, and that her contemporaries' children may end up having the same feelings, the people who were not raised as much by their parents. I don't know, I've always had this theory, we go through life making our grandparents' mistakes because we try so hard not to make our parents and their the same thing. But anyhow, that was my take on that. And I don't mean to talk too much, but I can't come next time, so I'm trying to say everything.
So you're getting your share in this time. That's okay. That's actually really interesting. I hadn't thought about that there is a kind of different generations trading off. I'm not sure. It's interesting. I'm not certain that we get enough information about the state of the world at the time that Riva gave birth to Shira, to know if she was out of step with people of her time, that most women were still at that point primarily defining themselves through motherhood and family.
Yeah.
Or
I don't know that, but Riva didn't give birth. That was one of the interesting things I thought.
Well,
but
I
don't know whether
yes, exactly. Yes, you're right. That she arranged to have a child through technology, which is part of what was happening for many women at that point. Shira's contemporaries were doing what her mother did. So in that sense, yes, absolutely. So I want to pick up on a couple of other sort of broadly environmental concepts, not so much about climate change, but about social environment. So we've talked about the idea of class in this novel, and those of you who know me well know that is near and dear to my heart. A very large part of my work is on the study of the working class in America. And Piercy identifies these 4 social sectors. So we've got the multis, that are the corporations and the people who work for them, the most privileged people. You've got the glop, who are like the other end of the spectrum in the part of the world that most people know about. They are the most working class, the most at risk, the most struggling. Like working class people often, creative, occasionally violent, entrepreneurial in all of the ways that they're trying to be able to support themselves, but also clearly struggling. And it isn't even so much about how much money they have. It's about their access to the protections of a wrap or of a dome or whatever kind of environmental protection. That in some ways is the currency, even more than money, even though we see Shira being worried about being robbed as she moves through the glop, because having money would let you buy things in the glop, but it's not a purely economic kind of difference as we often think class is. As a scholar of class, I would say class is never only an economic thing, but here it really is highlighted that way. Then there are the free towns like Tikva, and Tikva is the only one I think that we see over the course of the novel, but we are told that there are others like this, where some group of people manages to find a way to keep themselves safe, to build a community, and to make themselves useful to the multis so that they are not fully absorbed by them. There's a kind of negotiation here about how they can find a space for themselves. And then there is this community in Israel that Neely comes from, that is, it's almost, it's like a little pocket of socialism somewhere in a capitalist world, and I'm not really talking about their economic system, but the idea that they aren't even part of the system that everybody else exists in. In fact, it is like Wakanda. They're not even visible to most of the world. And Neely is here to begin to kind of check and see, is there a way to connect with that? So Piercy very clearly lays out a stratified world. And then in an interesting way moves Shira and Gotti both from the multis back to the free towns, and puts the existence of the free town in conflict with the multi. So YS basically wants to claim Tikva on some level in order to get at I was going to say assets plural, but really a lot of it is about trying to get to Yud and that technology. But we see that kind of navigation between them. And I think that the power struggles of that infuse the environmental struggles and vice versa, that those two things kind of shape each other as we look at this novel in ways that, we talked last time about all of the changes in the world that Piercy had predicted. And most of what we were talking about was technological. But this is also a social shift that she predicts that is about the rising power of corporations, the different kind of power that sort of some independent outlier things can have, and a whole lot of people who are caught in the middle. And I think it's just useful to think about that. I want to take a little bit of time to really focus in on Tikva as a particular kind of community and think about the cultural environment that Piercy is establishing. So she makes very clear from the beginning that Tikva is a Jewish community. And as I said last time, I see this as Piercy's most fully engaged Jewish novel, partially just on a surface level. And what I mean by that is that Tikva is so clearly Jewish, and it's like she drops in little places, little pieces of Jewish practice, little pieces of Jewish theology that are just kind of almost like offhand references that help to remind us and reinforce that her primary characters are Jewish and this is a Jewish world. But we also have Tikva as this at-risk community kind of off on the side of the world. What makes Tikva a distinctly Jewish place, and why does that matter? Beyond the fact that as Jews, we like it. What makes it matter in the context of the novel? Camilla, is that your hand up? Yeah, go ahead.
I guess a couple of things occurred to me is that whenever I hear them reference something Jewish, there's always this feeling of continuity. So how Tikva is connected to the past. And of course, then the golem and those stories, reinforce that even further. Then I also found myself thinking of, when you were talking about the Maltese, how they were wanting Tikva. And, well, first of all, in my mind, rich people always want anything they don't have. But in history, oftentimes the minute the Jews did a little too well, then that's when everybody else would start going after them. And so there's also that parallel too. And I guess that's the only things I thought of right off the top of my head.
Yeah, that's great. Great observations. Luther and then Martha.
Yeah, that's what an interesting question. It hadn't occurred to me, but now that you ask it, Tikva and Neely's renegade group, those are the only groups that are practicing any kind of spirituality. Every other group, whether it's in the Glop or in the Maltese, it's all material. Now, like I said, it's possible that in Piercy's mind there was spiritual life in the Glop, but she doesn't reveal it to us.
Right.
The Maltese are entirely materialistic. There's nothing but that.
Right. And Luther, I think you're right with one very surface level difference, which is that Piercy makes reference at some point to, I don't think it's YS, I think it's another multi that whose official religion is a version of like Shintoist Buddhism or something, that is a kind of, but it's a very surface kind of thing, whereas it's really embedded in life in Tikva. It shapes the pattern of the week. It shapes things about people's interactions. It's much more central. So it's not that it doesn't exist at all, but I think the best way to think about it, as you just said, is that we don't see it. It's not important enough that it rises to the surface and becomes a shaping element, which it is clearly for Tikva. Martha.
So I'm kind of figuring this out as I speak. So historically, Hebrews and Jews were kind of a culturally sort of in the face of the powers, but also not completely in their face, also in relationship with them, serving them in some way. So that is kind of Tikva's role.
Absolutely.
There's a quip somewhere. It's towards the end, but I don't think I'm revealing too much when I say that they're going to have a council meeting and vote on something, and somebody from the multi basically said how quaint.
Yep.
Now, and also there is, as somebody said, this continuity. Obviously, Israel's been wiped out, and I am wondering if is Marge Piercy an anti-Zionist? She basically is saying it doesn't work to have her.
I mean, she was earlier in her career. I don't know if her position has changed over time, but there was a point earlier in her career when she was very resistant to Zionism.
Okay. So then she's imagining a Jewish, in some ways it's almost hysterical. It's like my summer camp became, this town in Massachusetts where there are a lot of liberal Jewish communities. So.
Yeah. and Israel became the black zone that is like erased, but in part because the whole region blew up is sort of what she imagines. And it's kind of easy. I mean, that's not a prediction that seems out of whack with the possibility, I hate to say it, of the future of the world. And yet there is this community that's rebuilding there. And in Tikva, we have, as somebody said, that it seems like a modern moshav, Charlie. that there are clearly in Tikva not just elements of Jewish life, but there's a very Israeli feel to
Yep.
Tikva.
Mhm.
The central dining hall, there's the everybody has to do their part in patrolling the perimeter and all of those kinds of things that feel very much like all the things I remember reading about how a moshav or a kibbutz worked when I was when I was in Hebrew school in the late 60s and early 70s. So there is very strong sense of that. And then I think also, Martha, I want to go back and highlight the point you're making about Jews being both separate and often necessary and economically useful to whatever the dominant population was and to the operations of capitalism broadly. And that we see that kind of relationship along with the sense that Jews are a little archaic. They actually, part of what they say about Shira in the YS files is it's not just that, she had her baby in, quote unquote, natural methods, but that she's attached to her grandmother. She wants to go back home for holidays. All of this is seen as kind of old fashioned. It's a little too ethnic.
Mhm.
And we're seeing all of that play out in the way Jews are seen by the multis, and yet they are also very clearly seen as useful, in part because of the things that they produce. Karen.
So there's a kind of implicit argument in the book that comes down to Jewish pride. This may seem off topic, but I recently saw a parody of George Santos in which he claims that he invented gravity. So what with this little play within the play of what's going on with the golem, we invented technology. I think there's a kind of Jewish nationalistic pride that's really saying that.
Yeah. That's a really interesting observation because we invented technology. There's things that says about technology that I want to get to before we're done tonight, but I'm going to cycle back around to that. But also that Tikva is a place of cooperation. It's a place of safety, a place of peace, a place of there's real food. There is, all kinds of things that make this community work, including how they deal with conflict, that makes it almost like a little piece of utopia inside this big dystopian world. And that too is a version of Jewish pride, of a kind of vision that says, well, look what we created. We know how to do this. The rest of you are a mess, but we know how to do this. And yet that it's still threatened and remains vulnerable. Cheryl put in the chat that we can think of Tikva as a kind of a ghetto, and we can. And I'm going to put a kind of but at the end of that, because I do think that Tikva as a ghetto functions very differently than the Jewish ghetto in Prague. We get the parallel stories, but no one in this novel has been forced to live in Tikva. No one is kept from leaving it. And the attacks on Tikva are not about, oh, those Jews, they killed Jesus, or they killed innocent children in order to put blood on their doors for Passover. They actually make things that we want. That's a different way of ghettoizing. So it is a ghetto in the sense that it's walled in and people there are all Jewish, but it isn't threatened in quite the same way. And it's part of where the parallel with the Prague ghetto for me, falls apart a little bit. I mean, I think it works really well paralleling Yud and Joseph. I think it works really well in the idea of a Jewish community where people are working really well together, kind of being up against a more powerful Gentile world outside. But the nature of the threat is a little bit different. And I think it's just worth thinking about that. Susan.
Thank you, Sherry. Yeah, I don't have sort of a general point of view on this, but I really love the little paragraph where she talks about the word davar, and that in Hebrew it means both thing and word. And it's sort of implied that the Jews had already figured it out, that thought can create. And so this is how the technology comes about, and how you can shapeshift and stuff by just thinking yourself different. And so it sort of shows that the Jews were in the vanguard. Maybe this is part of the Jewish pride, but it was also, they're the ones who develop and promote and sell these, and I can't pronounce it. Is it chimera or chimera, or how do you, or is it CHI?
Chimera.
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 The things that Gaudi makes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, no, actually, Malka.
No, the things
Yeah,
that Malka
Malka.
makes.
Yeah,
Because
not the virons.
Those are the dead ends, the things that people
Yeah.
fall into a trap.
Yeah.
And actually, I just, looking up how to pronounce it on Google, I found out that it's actually originates from Greek mythology. It was a fire-breathing she monster. And it's like, oh, well, that, of course, that fits perfectly with the book.
It does. And with Malka as the primary creator.
Exactly.
Yeah. I love that. I love that. That's great. Well, so that might help us. That seems like a good way to transition to the other half of the trouble that I think we have to dig into in this novel, which is the troubles of technology. And I will get to Yud. I promise we will get to Yud. I know that's like the thing we all really want to talk about. But I want to start with thinking about the ways that technology both causes trouble in the world of this novel and helps people deal with trouble. So, we've got like the wrap that helps them stay safe. We've got the sex skins that help them be able to go out into the world, so that technology is sometimes a protective kind of thing. What other ways does technology help people live here or cause part of the trouble? Charlotte.
It's the house. I hate the house. The house is both a protector and it keeps them in prison. The house knows everything, tells them everything, won't let people in. It could be a protector. I think the house, which of course, she didn't have Alexa and all of that when she wrote this in 1991. I think the house is the perfect symbol of what you're talking about.
And I love that, because you can see how the house was meant to help and does, and yet also is kind of a pain. I mean, and that the house Malka has programmed the house enough to give it a little bit more personality than your typical house, apparently, and a little bit more independence. I love the whole part of, the house clearly is not happy about Shira's relationship with Yud. And there's one of the moments when Yud is coming to see Shira at night, and the house notes that she can see in the dark. And so, I mean, there's all kinds of things going on with that. Elise.
Thanks. Yeah, I thought the house is great comic relief. I was just noticed one thing, maybe because I work in like the renewable energy world, and whenever I read something futuristic or see a movie, it was like, where do they get their energy? And all of a sudden there's like a throwaway line of like, oh, we have fusion now, so we just make our energy from seawater. It's like this one sort of really optimistic thing has happened, that they've solved the energy problem. Everything else is a mess, but that's like sort of taken care of. I thought it was kind of interesting.
That's right. I mean, it is part of the convenience of imagining a future world, even if you're imagining a dystopia. you can also imagine, I mean, even things like, all of the vat made food as a way of dealing with famine. It's like, yeah, we'll just make it from algae, and we don't have to talk at all about the details of that, So there are ways in which technology becomes an easy problem solution. Camilla.
Well, I'm sure this is not what you were looking for, but I couldn't not say it anyway. The underlying thing, but the unsaid thing is that the whole mess had to come from an overuse of technology in a way, right? Because there's no appreciation of the natural world, even like the plants and whatnot that they're eating, the quote unquote real plants. I mean, there's no sense of ecology, they just put it in the house with the fake light, and that's just how everything is being handled.
Yeah, I actually love that observation. I think the reminder that we got into all of this climate trouble, and we got into all of the digital security trouble because of technology. That's what got us there. And there's not a lot of reference to that history, especially to, the overuse of fossil fuels. I mean, there's a little bit, but, and the novel doesn't set out to tell us how did the world of Tikva and the Maltese come to be, but we all know that. And I think this may be a thing where reading it now, we're even more conscious of that than readers might have been in 1992 when the novel came out. So I just think that's a really interesting and really useful observation. Judy.
Yeah, I was struck by the message robot that delivered messages. And in order to make sure you were the person, you had to give some DNA or blood along the way. And if you were the wrong person, it was going to blow itself up. And then to send something back, you could just imagine how many messages really got through. I mean, if it had to go out in the glop, maybe somebody would intercept it. So
yeah.
How efficient really was that?
Yeah. Well, and yet it's interesting to think about that in the context of sort of online security and the idea that nothing in the net was going to be completely secure. That wasn't going to give you the real proof of where Ari was. For that, you actually needed the blood because you needed the body. So, and I suppose, I mean, this is a real stretch. It's just popped into my head that it's interesting that the villagers, the people in Prague attacking the Jewish ghetto are about the idea of the use of blood of young boys. And Shira's effort to connect with her son and find out exactly where he comes from involves the blood of her own son and her own blood. I mean, it's just, I don't know. I don't know quite what to think of that, but it's just an interesting parallel. Carol.
So the way they connect to the net with their minds and the way they work with their minds and the notion that more than 5 hours is not good for you on your technology, that really struck me. And the fact that you can go forever, right? They have built the cyborg to be able to work endlessly. But the notion of connecting with your, just, you go in.
Yeah. And it's a direct connection.
Yeah.
But that the difference, and in some ways, the clearest difference between the humans in the novel and Yud is about endurance. He can enter the net and he can be there always. They have to limit, that humanity sets limits on us. Technology can take away those limits, not necessarily in ways that are good. Marcia's comment in the chat, I think, gets at a version of that technology can swallow you up. Technology can physically damage you as well as mentally damage you. I mean, it it can be a threat, and yet there are all of these ways that people have to use it, which sounds very familiar for us now. You know, it's very hard to do all kinds of things if you don't have your phone. And yet we also know that taking a break from that can be helpful to our mental health and otherwise. Elena?
This may be off topic, and if so, please stop me. But I mean, it seemed to me there was a discussion about the world having, in this novel, having gotten the way that it was because of technology. And I just fear that that's a cop-out, because it's not, there's no story that suggests that what happened was somehow the technology, independent of the way human beings chose to deploy it, caused the world. And if anything, it's the world that we are now in the novel, where you're creating a being like Yud, who might be able to be a creature of technology, who actually isn't simply being deployed by humans, perhaps with poor judgment, perhaps becoming, you know, enraptured by their own creation or whatever, but who's actually, you know, able to operate independently of that. That is, at some level, you know, calling into question many premises. But it seems to me that you need to be careful not to suggest that there was no human culpability at root in all of these things. I mean, technology in the end is not, I think, inherently good, bad, or indifferent. It's really the question of what we do with it.
Exactly. And that's really what I meant. But I think you're also getting us to a really core point that we always have to be talking about when we think about technology, and that science fiction novels generally do a really good job of pushing us to wrestle with, which is that technology is a tool. Technology does not operate on its own. And everything that happens with technology, even in some ways, what is possible for Yud, is shaped by the choices that humans make. You know, we will talk next time about the end of Yud's story, but I'll just say now that all of his capabilities come from the choices and intentions of Avram and Malka, with a little bit of input from other people, but that he is constructed to be a certain way. And even his independence is shaped in part by that. So I think, Elena, your point is exactly something that runs through all of this, that it's all in some ways both an invitation to think about how do we engage with technology, what makes technology function, how are we separate from technology, but also how are we implicated in it? And what is our role and what are our responsibilities? I think that's like maybe the central theme of the novel and of lots of writing that engages with technology in these ways. So thank you for that. That's exactly where we needed to go. Ralph.
Yeah, and I related to that. I love that dystopian metaphor of being so intimately connected into the you know, into the system there, that you're not aware of your surroundings, and that the internet can then reach out and actually destroy your mind. That was scary.
Yeah, it's a terrifying image. And I think even more so now, one of many things in the novel that is scarier today than it was when the novel was written, because we're closer to doing that kind of thing. Anne.
Yeah, I was going to say some of what Elena said very well. So, but I agree that technology isn't inherently negative itself. A lot of the examples we're giving are kind of scary, but it was really, if you look at the fathers of Yud and the father of the Golem, they were really the bad guys, you know, and I don't want to give away the end of the book, but particularly the Golem, you know, who is become such a sympathetic character. And I really cared about the Golem, and I was very angry and upset about the, you know, at the rabbi who created him and what he does. And so I think, again, it really falls on the humans to take responsibility for what they're creating and what they're putting into it.
Right. And yet I think it's interesting that part of what both the story of the golem and the story of Yud make clear to us is that a lot of the story of technology and of the effects of technology are examples of unintended consequences. That in both cases, these are figures who are created to protect. And that desire to protect takes precedence over ethical and moral questions about what is my responsibility to the thing I'm creating and for the thing I'm creating. And I think across the history of technology, this has been the paradox. We want faster transportation. We want independence and the ability to go where we want to go on the schedule that we want. And that means I want a car. And that means I want everybody in my household to have their own car. And guess what? Over time, that brings all kinds of negative consequences. It's there are relatively few technologies. I don't want to try to get into a whole history of technology, but there are relatively few technologies that somebody created with negative intent. We create almost all of them to make our lives easier, to make people safer, to help our health, to help us work better, to help us have fun, all kinds of things. And then it turns out that many of them, maybe even most of them, have something about them that makes our life, that endangers us on some level, or because sometimes it's both, raise really troubling ethical questions about what is our responsibility in the world and how do we take care of this earth and how do we take care of each other and what is the cost of protecting my people? What am I willing to do that? And those are kind of like fundamental questions that lie behind all of this. Julia.
A couple of weeks ago, there was a poll of the readers in Washington Jewish Week. I don't know if anyone else reads it. The question was, when you're interacting with Alexa, when you ask her something to do something, do you say please? And when she does it, do you say thank you? And interestingly, it was pretty much 50-50. That half didn't, half didn't. And I thought it was so relevant to this book and the issues this book raises.
That's right.
Alexa is in most of our homes. Alexa is on my watch and my Apple Watch,
Yeah. And it may be that because I had read this novel and probably I'd read a fair amount of science fiction when I was a teenager, that when Alexa came out, I was like, no way. I don't want that in my home. I don't trust it. Maybe I was thinking of the house in he, she, and it. But that points us to, I think, a fundamental piece of trouble in this novel, to return to that concept, which is the trouble that Yod's creation causes. And I don't just mean the ethical and moral questions about was it right to do that. We'll talk about that when we come back in 2 weeks and really kind of reflect on the novel as a whole. But what Yod reveals to us about technology and the idea that technology can be an expression of ingenuity and creativity and good intentions and of intellect. You think about the pleasure that Malka takes in her work, in building the chimeras and in training Yod, that all of that suggests technology as a source of pleasure. Our tendency, our desire to, our habit maybe of humanizing both machines, and you think about all of the ways that we humanize our animals. I mean, my husband and I have long conversations about what our dog is probably thinking. And, and in some ways we do the same kind of thing with a figure like Yud, but then also raising questions for us about, well, what makes what makes Yud human, which of course immediately raises questions about what makes us human. So what is our relationship with technology? How are we different from technology? Karen.
So picking up on what Julia said, the first time I heard my wife ask the thermostat to raise the temperature to 68, and then she said, "Thank you," I thought, she's lost it. But it's really, it's good. I do it now too. I think that the character of Yud is changing my attitude toward artificial intelligence and robots, because I really don't like robots. I say this, my son is the director of the robotics lab at the University of Maryland. But my feeling about robots goes back to when I was covering a branch at George Mason University and leaving work around 5:30 or 6 at night. And these white objects on the ground were racing towards me. And you didn't know which way to go. And at the last second, averting me. And they're delivering food.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a whole different take on it.
Yeah.
And just one passage I want to share, that when Shira is constantly debating this, issue about being with him, I think it's on page 198. No, that's not where it is. Where she's basically saying, what's the difference? When I'm with a man, do I think about his liver and his stomach?
Yeah.
And his organs? What's the difference between that and thinking about your biochips? So anyway.
Right. Well, and I want to pick up on two things with that. So one is this whole notion of both what we're made of and programming. So as Shira is engaging in this relationship with Yud, and she's thinking about, well, of course he satisfied me in bed. He was programmed to do that. And how do I feel about that? But the notion that we're all in some ways programmed in how we deal with each other. Yud was trained, to be programmed. Part of what happens is that Malka and Avram write code. But part of what happens is that Malka tells him stories. And Shira hangs out with him and goes for walks with him and has him practice interacting with people. It's kind of like what we do with children. Socialization and programming are maybe not that different. So yeah, as Luther says, programming is learning. I mean, there's lots of discussion. There has been a lot of discussion in education in the last decade or so about machine learning and the ways that we might be able to borrow some of the ways we train computers to do certain things in ways we train children. These are not entirely different. So part of it, takes us back to that question of what makes Yud different, and what are the conditions in our relations with other human beings, but also with non-human entities of all kinds that make something feel human. One of the things, I'll say one more thing, and then I want to turn to some folks. One of the things that strikes me really interesting early in this novel is that when Shira first meets Yud, there's about 5 pages, maybe not even that much, when she is kind of thinking about, well, what do I call it? And she's kind of pushing back when Malka calls Yud him. She's like, it's a machine. But within pages, she's doing exactly the same. And part of that is her programming, that she gets programmed by the nature of her interaction with him to treat him as a person. Camilla, and then Ralph.
Yeah, and I just wanted to throw in there that our programming isn't just what we learn, it's our biology. And, when geneticists look and they try to define how much of it is nurture and how much of it is nature, it usually comes out about 50-50, surprisingly enough. And, every mother or father here must remember that, the kids come out and they really have a personality. I mean, you can have an effect on that personality, but they do have a personality when they arrive. So I just, found myself fascinated with this book and Yod because of that. It made me really think a lot about, well, how different am I really from Yod? And it was really a fascinating thing. And the way she set it up, I thought was so interesting. I'm really grateful.
Yeah, it is. She does construct it in a way that I think really invites us to think through these questions. It's part of what I like about the novel. Ralph?
Yeah, and another contrast, I mean, I was thinking about the Yud versus a child growing up. But Yud starts with this full computer intelligence, but has social naivete, whereas kids are naive and they don't have the learning experience. So he has it on one end, but not the other. So I thought that would, but I think she handled that very gracefully.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that he has all of this capability and the independence. We were talking last time about his encounter with the Frankenstein story and hearing Gotti refer to him as son of Frankenstein, and then going and finding the book and reading it, so that he has the independent will to seek things out and say, oh, I'm curious about this, let me go read that. And yet he's still so clearly developing and kind of beginning to come into being. I know I've missed a ton of things in the chat, but Cheryl, I'm looking at your comment about Yud being created, that his orientation and his purpose is around violence. And that, I mean, parallel to that, his primary directive, as science fiction people might say, is protection.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a moment, I think near the end of the section that we were looking at for tonight, where there's this question of, if they're going to go into the glop, does he protect Shira or Neely or Gotti? Or maybe it's actually when Riva and Neely arrive, and there's just this question of who does he protect, but that his mission is to protect people, but that often requires violence. It requires surveillance as well as violence, and that there's one more piece of it, and we see this in Joseph too. There's a piece of his programming where he takes pleasure in the violence.
Right.
He is also, and Joseph makes a good parallel with this. I think both of them, when they have that experience, they are also troubled by it. And I find that very powerful. To me, that is part of how Piercy constructs these human-made figures as not just serving the interests of their masters, of their creators, but of having a conscience. And that, one of the things that we would say, I think, makes a human different from a machine is that a human has a conscience. A human has a voice. We have a voice inside of us that says, this is or is not the right thing to do. If we're assuming we're not psychopaths, we have that voice inside of us that is going to think in that way. So do both of these figures, Joseph and Yud, have that. I wonder I just wonder what people think about that. Or I'm like, where does that come from? some of it, I will remind myself and remind you of the thing that I'm always telling my students when we're reading a novel and they want to know, why did this character do X, Y, or Z? And my bottom line answer is because the writer who created them wanted them to. The writer decided that was essential. So Piercy decided that it was essential that both Joseph and Yud have a conscience. How does that, I apologize for the weird phrasing. How does that serve the novel? Why is that important in the novel? Annie?
I thought it made more sense for Yud than it did for Joseph, because I thought that was part of Malka's programming of Yud, whereas Joseph came from this ancient Kabbalistic process that he was designed only to protect, but apparently, I don't know, there was something there that even Judah didn't know. And it definitely served the novel's purposes. I mean, it made the parallels make sense. It made Yud's feeling about Shira match Joseph's feelings about Hava, but of course, Hava and Shira had very different reactions to that too.
Yes, it's true. Though they had them for different reasons. I just want to, because I think that we started out early on tonight talking about all of the ways that Shira seems like a wounded character.
Yes.
To use Elisa's language, I think that's a really perfect term for it. And all of the reasons why Hava really is not. Hava is an incredibly strong character who has a very clear sense of what she wants.
And she's in that way willing to give up her child.
Yes.
So that she can realize herself. And she is more like Riva in that way than she is like Shira.
Yeah, she's also in some almost like a hybrid of Riva and Shira, in that she's got the warmth and the desire for human connection that Shira has. I mean, just the very fact of her work as a midwife.
Yeah.
So she's both the midwife and the scholar. So maybe in some ways she's more like Malka. I don't know, but yeah. Anyway, Luther.
Well, both Yud and Joseph, in order to fulfill their function, have to be able to make decisions. They have to be able to make choices, or they can't fulfill their function. They can't exercise the problem solving that's necessary in order to fulfill it. And in that sense, it probably sounds off the wall, but they have to have free will. And if you're going to have free will, you have to have a conscience.
Yeah.
Very Jewish.
It is very Jewish. and I think that's spot on. I think that that their purpose requires them to be able to, conscience, but also a kind of critical thinking that is more than what a binary code, even the most sophisticated binary code would be able to predict, because they have to be able to go into situations that are unpredictable and make judgments. And part of what that reminds us of is that conscience is part of judgment making. Conscience is part of critical thinking. And that is part of what helps to make us human. Charlotte.
I have another way of thinking about this. I was fascinated by the title of one of the chapters, How Can We Tell the Dancer from the Dance, which is a quote from Yeats. And to me, we're saying you can add up the qualities that make a human. You can say it has a conscience, you can say he has free will, etc. But it's the totality that makes the human, not the series of qualities. And the other thing is, Yeats was thinking about this 100 years ago. So it's not a technology question, it's something different. And so I think that her just referring like that is very interesting.
Yeah, that's a great observation. And a good reminder that the questions of what make us human, those are really old questions. And it is true that technologies of all kinds, you know, the iPhone that has its conscience in the book that Luther was talking about at the beginning, or, you know, any version of a machine that has a consciousness. I was going somewhere with that. My brain just stopped. I'm sorry. I forget what it was. I was going to say, let's go back to the board, Julia.
Well, I think that the author, in giving Yud and Joseph conscience or strong aspects of conscience, really made me a lot more interested in the book. I found myself relating to them as though they were human and really caring about them. And I have not read the end yet. I don't know what happens. I'm worried about them with these very unpleasant father figures they have. But I thought she was almost made them human.
Yeah.
So, because of the conscience.
Which means she puts us in the position of the characters in the novel.
Yeah.
That we relate to Yud as human, maybe not quite in the same ways that Shira does, but in some of those same ways. Yeah, Ralph.
And I like the way that Yud and a little bit Joseph too, once something happens, they play it back in their mind to say, how could they do better next time? Yeah. Although the people with artificial intelligence might say, if they have so much capacity, why couldn't they have played out the scenarios ahead of time and been more predictive that this would have worked or this would have, or are humans that irrational? Except
that artificial intelligence does exactly that. So a couple of people had made it. We had a conversation on the Temple listserv a couple of weeks ago about ChatGPT, and one point about ChatGPT, and there's also an image AI program that a lot of people have been playing with over the last couple of months. Every time one of us goes into ChatGPT to just play around and see, you know, somebody on what the listserv had said is, I want to ask it to write a bar mitzvah speech. You know, whatever it is you go in to ask it to do, it does that. And it learns from every time we ask it to do something. So it gets better and better over time through our interactions with it. And that's part of how artificial intelligence gets refined. It gets better and better by those interactions. Not entirely unlike us. All of us, in whatever we do, we learn how to get better at it by doing it. I mean, I have actually written about a whole model of pedagogy that is about learning by doing, where a huge part of what I have my students do is do stuff and then reflect. Well, how did it work? You know, I actually teach graduate students how to teach. And one of the ways I do it is by making them plan and design and lead a day of class and then reflect on how it went. So it's exactly like what we do with Yud. You know, this is how football coaches teach kids how to throw a pass. It's how piano teachers teach kids how to refine, you know, their whatever, their glissando. You know, it's about, you do things and sometimes you're getting that coaching from someone else, but often we're also just doing it ourselves. So it's the learning that is in some ways so familiar. And so interesting to watch in Yud. We only have a few minutes left, and we haven't talked at all, and maybe we'll just come back to this next time, about the whole question of the difference between Yud and Neely, as two figures who are both kind of hybrids. And Shira at some point, actually, I think in an early conversation with Gadi, when Gadi finds out that both that Yud is a cyborg and that Shira is having a relationship with him, and he's teasing her about it. And she's like, look, we all have these enhancements from technology. And there is a passage where Neely talks about the kinds of enhancements that she and the people in her home community have made. So she talks about them, doing cloning and having been, fitted with things so that they can survive outside in the climate as it is, and all of these different changes that we see kind of humans and technologies bit by bit moving closer and closer together and becoming more and more alike. And that is happening in both directions. It's not just we're making machines that are more and more human-like. We may be having humans who are becoming more machine-like, at least in certain ways. There may be limits to that. But just thinking about how those parts fit together. So a couple of closing thoughts and some things to think about as we look ahead for next time. We're going to finish the novel. So both the imagined world and the characters in the novel, and the plot is all about encountering, responding to, and trying to resolve the troubles that invite us to think about our own world, our own selves, and the challenges we face. So that it's not, we've imagined this world out there that is in many ways familiar and in many ways different from our own. And we're encountering characters who are in many ways like us, but in many ways very different. I don't know about you, I haven't slept with a cyborg anytime recently. So, we have some differences in our world, and yet there are parts of it that are very much about our world and our lives. And part of what I hope we can talk about next time is sort of the things the novel, and we've started some of this already tonight, the things the novel makes us think about ourselves and our own lives and our own world, as well as the choices that Piercy makes in resolving the novel and the commentaries and the insights that she ultimately offers us. That's kind of where we're headed. We're going to be back in 2 weeks on February 9th to finish it up. Any final thoughts or comments before we wrap up and go? I've seen a few people yawning. I've been yawning. It's a Thursday night. So, Charlie.
I just think it's very interesting as we're talking about consciousness and all the human qualities that may or may not be attributable to the cyborg. It's just a huge contrast to the beginning of the book, where all the people in her world are as dehumanized as possible. And it seems as if we're going in two directions in the novel, less and more.
Yeah. We very much see the mostly unnamed people around her at the very beginning as very machine-like. And certainly almost everything in YS seems to function that way. It's one of the ways that that Tikva is set up as a different kind of place, but it's also part of what Piercy is pushing back against, I think, in telling us the story. It's a wonderful observation. Thank you. Ralph, one last comment?
Yeah, Sherry, I just love the way, you bring a logical conversation to this and you incorporate people in. That's such a professional skill, and we really appreciate that.
Thanks. As I hope you can tell, I'm having a great time doing this. This is just really, really lovely and great fun. So I will see you all in a couple of weeks.